Imagine the vast, windswept hills of medieval England. A lone figure wrapped in coarse wool slowly follows his herd across the snowy wasteland. He is a shepherd, a man whose life was synonymous with solitude, constant movement, and a deep connection with nature. His image is often romanticized, painting idyllic pictures of pastoral life. But what happened when the merciless, freezing winter descended on these hills? If even a peasant struggled desperately to survive in his village hut, even if it was a small, stationary one, what was it like for a shepherd? His home is often a temporary, squalid shelter in the middle of a wasteland. His hearth was a small fire, the fuel for which had to be found under the snow. His only companions were his sheep and his faithful dog. For the shepherd, winter was not just a test, but a war, where every day could be his last, for him or for his precious flock. So how did he survive, one-on-one with the elements? What ingenious tricks passed down to him from his father and grandfather allowed him to stay warm in an icy blizzard, protect his herd, and wait for the first spring grass? There were no castle walls or full barns in his survival. There was only incredible resilience, a deep knowledge of nature, and the art of using what others would consider trash. Stay with us to the end, and you will learn why the sheep were not only a source of income for the shepherd, but also a living wall against the wind. How his clothes became a waterproof cocoon, what fuel he found where there seemed to be nothing to burn, and why his solitude was his main strength. This is a tale of the true art of surviving alone with nature. The shepherd's house rarely looked like a fixed peasant hut in the village. Most often it was a small, rudely built temporary shelter, built directly in the pasture, in a place protected from the strongest winds. Such huts were built from whatever was at hand: turf, stones, heather, twigs. They were squat, often partially sunken into the ground to utilize the heat of the soil. Walls of sod blocks or stones laid dry were excellent insulators. The art of such masonry, without mortar, was to fit the stones perfectly, and the gaps left behind were carefully plugged with moss and earth, creating an almost airtight barrier to the wind. They kept out the wind and, unlike the stone of the castle walls, did not accumulate cold so much. The roof was covered with a thick layer of the same turf, heather or reeds, beneath which was hidden a framework of rough twigs, or, if they were lucky, driftwood thrown up by the sea. Over time, grass would grow on the roof, making the hut almost indistinguishable from the surrounding hill. It was not so much a house as an improved burrow, a den where one could wait out the worst of the weather. There was nothing superfluous inside. There was an earthen floor covered with dried ferns or heather, a place for a small hearth, and a bed of twigs covered with sheepskin. The size of the hut was minimal, just enough to accommodate the shepherd, his dog, and on the harshest nights, a few newborn lambs to be rescued from the cold. Once inside, the shepherd was in another world. The air here was thick with the smell of damp earth, the acrid smoke of the peat fire, sheepskin, and his wet dog. In this tiny dark space protected by the low ceiling, the outside world with its howling wind and icy cold receded. It was not just a hut, but a psychological shelter, a primitive den that gave him a sense of security and separation from the hostile infinity of the winter night. Here he was not just a man, but a part of the earth itself. The genius of this dwelling lay in its mobility and simplicity. A herder could build such a shelter in a few days in any convenient place, using only what the surrounding wasteland provided. It was survival architecture, adapted as much as possible to the nomadic way of life. It was not expensive and was completely biodegradable. Abandoned in spring, such a hut in a few years almost completely merged with the landscape, returning to nature the materials taken from it and leaving behind only barely visible outlines on the ground, the silent trace of a lonely man. Of course, such a hut was not a model of comfort. It was dark, cramped, and smoky, but it fulfilled its main function. It gave protection from wind and precipitation, allowing to keep precious warmth. It was not a place to live, but a place to survive, a temporary bastion in the endless war with the winter elements. But the shepherd's most important shelter was not inside these walls. It was created by the herd itself. The shepherd's main value and main concern were his sheep, but in winter they became not only an object of protection, but also his main allies in the fight against the cold. A flock of hundreds of animals would turn into a giant, living warmth in an airtight wall, an ingenious trick that only a shepherd could use. Sheep, thanks to their thick wool, are very well able to bear the cold, but they are afraid of strong winds and snowstorms. Therefore, the shepherd built a special enclosure or sheepfold for them for the winter. Often, natural shelters were chosen for this purpose: ravines, gullies, places protected by hills or forest. A wall of stones, turf, or a fence of branches was built on the windward side. Inside this pen, the sheep were huddled together in a dense mass. Hundreds of bodies pressed against each other, generating a tremendous amount of heat. The temperature inside this huddled flock was many degrees higher than the temperature of the surrounding air. On a frosty morning, a thick vapor rose from this living, breathing mass, as if from a huge cauldron. It was not just a herd, but a single warm blanket made of hundreds of bodies and thick lanolin-soaked wool. The shepherd often made his shelter or simply spent the coldest hours of the night right against the corral wall, to leeward of this living radiator. Moreover, the very mass of the sheep created an insurmountable barrier to the wind. The shepherd could hide behind his flock like a stone wall. He would lie down on the ground, and hundreds of sheep would form a living, warm, and breathing cocoon around him, protecting him from the icy gusts. The smell of wet wool and sheep was the shepherd's constant companion, but it was the smell of life and warmth. But it wasn't just physical warmth. The shepherd was attuned to his flock like a musician to an instrument. At night in the dark, he listened to their breathing, the measured, quiet bleating, the quiet chewing of cud, the rustling of bodies. All this was to him the music of life, the confirmation that all was well. Any alien sound, any change in that chorus, an alarmed cry, a panicked movement, instantly brought him to his feet. He understood the language of his herd, and that knowledge was as important a survival tool as his staff or his knife. But such proximity had its risks. The shepherd knew not to let his guard down. A sudden fright caused by a predator or just a loud sound could lead to panic, and hundreds of mad sheep could trample both him and his dog in blind terror. In addition, this overcrowding facilitated the rapid spread of diseases, such as sheeppox or hoof rot. Losing part of the flock to an epidemic in winter was tantamount to a death sentence for the shepherd himself. The bedding in the corral, consisting of dung and straw, also gave off heat as it rotted, further warming the ground. The shepherd and his dog often slept directly on this warm bedding, next to their charges. It was a perfect symbiotic system. The shepherd protected the sheep from predators and weather, and the sheep in return shared their collective warmth with him. This amazing cunning was the basis of survival, but it alone was not enough. At the center of this living warmth, a small but so important fire had to burn. While for the peasant in the village the hearth was the center of the house, for the shepherd, often far from a permanent dwelling, the fire was the only source of fire, warmth, and hot food. Controlling this small, precious flame in the middle of a snowy wasteland was a true art, requiring knowledge, skill, and incredible frugality. It was not an easy task to start a fire in the penetrating wind on wet or frozen ground. The shepherd always carried with him a flint and a cross, as well as rubbing, a dried mushroom or a charred cloth, which could be easily ignited by a spark. He knew where to find dry fuel even after a long rain, under tree roots, in hollow trees, under overhanging rocks. The shepherd's fire was small and efficient. He could not afford the luxury of a large flame that devoured a lot of wood. His fire was small, well sheltered from the wind by stones or turf. Often he built it at the foot of a large boulder, which served as a natural heat reflector, directing all the heat toward the shepherd and his rookery. Sometimes he dug a small hole to protect the flames from wind gusts and make them less visible from afar. It was not just a fire, but an elaborate engineering construction in miniature. It provided just enough heat to warm his hands, cook a meager meal, and ward off wild beasts. The main problem was fuel. Wood was easier to find in wooded areas, but in the open hills and heathlands where sheep were often grazed, wood was rare. The shepherd had to gather anything that could burn. Dry heather branches, thorny shrubs, gorse, peat, which he could cut and dry in summer. But the main truly ingenious type of fuel for the shepherd was dried sheep dung. In summer, he collected it, dried it in the sun, and these briquettes became his main fuel supply for the winter. They burned slowly, gave an even heat, and hardly smoked at all. Using the waste products of his own herd was the height of pragmatism and created a completely closed cycle of survival. But the most important art was not making, but keeping the fire going. Fuel was too valuable to be allowed to burn all night. Therefore, like the settled peasants, the shepherd practiced covering the fire. Before going to bed, he would carefully cover the largest, smoldering embers with a thick layer of ash. This cut off the oxygen supply, and the coals went into a slow, economical, smoldering mode, keeping the heat until morning. At dawn, it was enough to rake the ashes and carefully fan the fire so that it flared up again, saving both rubbing and precious time. Fire was not only a source of warmth, but also a light in the long winter night, and a psychological defense against fear and loneliness. Sitting by the fire, under the vast starry sky, the shepherd felt less lost in this cold world. Each type of fuel gave its own special odor: the tart, earthy spirit of smoldering peat, or the dry, pungent aroma of burning gutter snipe. This smoke drove away not only wolves, but also pesky insects. In its light, the tiny world of the hut or night camp came to life, and everything outside this shivering circle of light was plunged into an even deeper, impenetrable darkness, full of uncertainty. Fire was his companion, his link to the human world, his little handmaid son. And to protect this son in himself, the shepherd wore a special armor, woven of the same material that gave him life. For a shepherd who spent his days and nights outdoors, clothing was not just protection from the cold, but his main home, his personal shelter, his second skin. And this skin was made of the finest material imaginable for the damp and windy English climate: sheep's wool. The basis of a shepherd's closet was a heavy, long, hooded cloak made of dense, unworn wool. The most common was the so-called panula, a rough, heavy cloak cut from a single piece of felt or dense cloth, with a deep hood, cucullus, sewn on. The genius of this article of clothing lay in lanolin, a natural fat found in sheep's wool. Without washing it off, shepherds obtained a virtually waterproof and windproof garment. Drops of rain or melting snow rolled off the cloak without penetrating the interior. The hood was just as important as the cloak itself. It protected not only his head, but also his face and neck from the icy wind, creating a small zone of calm around his face where he could breathe warmer air. Under the cloak, as with peasants, there were several layers of clothing: a linen shirt and one or two woolen tunics. The legs were protected by woolen wrappings or coarse pants. Special attention was paid to hands and feet, the most vulnerable parts of the body to cold. Shepherds wore thick woolen mittens and socks. Shoes were made of strong leather and often wrapped with additional pieces of cloth or hide for warmth. A special trick was taking care of the shoes. Simple leather clogs were constantly getting wet. To combat this, they were regularly smeared with animal fat or tar, creating a primitive water-repellent layer. The straw used to stuff shoes had a double function. It not only warmed, but also absorbed sweat, preventing chafing and fungal diseases. Every evening, the shepherd took out the wet straw and dried it by the fire, or replaced it with a new one. This simple hygiene saved feet from frostbite and disease. All the clothes were soaked with the odors of smoke, sweat, and sheep. They were rough, scratchy, heavy, but they worked. It created a kind of cocoon around the shepherd's body that kept his own heat in and kept out the cold and moisture from the outside. In this woolen cocoon, one could sleep directly on the snow, sheltered from the blizzard and not freeze. Even his shepherd staff became part of this survival system. During long periods of sitting in one place, watching the herd, the shepherd could stick his staff into the ground in front of him and throw his broad cloak over it. This created a kind of miniature tent, an airtight wigwam that protected him from the wind and allowed him to retain precious warmth. The color of clothing also mattered. Usually it was dark, non-black colors: gray, brown, dark green. Such clothes were not only practical, but also served as camouflage, allowing the shepherd to blend in with the landscape and not attract unnecessary attention. Neither predators nor robbers. These clothes were the product of his own labor. He sheared the sheep himself. His wife or he spun the wool and wove the cloth. He knew the value of every thread. His clothing was not just a thing, but an extension of himself, a symbol of his unbreakable bond with his flock and the land on which he lived. But clothes alone were not enough. Survival alone in the vast expanse required another intangible skill: the ability to read the signs of nature. The shepherd's genius lay not only in his skill in handling sheep or building a fire, but also in his deepest, most intuitive knowledge of his surroundings. For him, the landscape was not just a collection of hills, valleys, and forests. It was a living map full of clues, hiding places, and resources that he could read like an open book. This knowledge was his primary tool for survival. The shepherd knew every ravine, every hollow where he could shelter from the penetrating wind. He knew which trees or rocks offered the best protection from rain or snowstorms. He could predict by the direction of the wind, by the shape of the clouds, by the behavior of the birds, a change in the weather a few hours before it started, and had time to drive the herd to a safe place. He knew where to find water, an ice-free stream, or a spring hidden in the forest. He knew where under the snow to find edible roots or berries to diversify his meager diet. He knew which paths wolves traveled and where it was best not to stay overnight. This knowledge was the result of years of observation, the experience of his ancestors, passed on by word of mouth. The choice of the place for the winter pasture and sheepfold was not accidental. The shepherd chose the southern slopes of the hills, which were better warmed by the sun and protected from cold northern winds. He looked for places with good drainage so that the sheep would not be drowned by meltwater. He used natural barriers, dense shrubs, stone ridges as part of his enclosure. This ability to read the landscape turned a seemingly hostile nature into his ally. He did not fight it, but cooperated with it, using its strengths to defend himself. His architecture was the hills, his walls the forests, his roof the overhanging cliffs. He was not just a man of the land, he was part of it, seamlessly integrated into its ecosystem. This was one of his main tricks. He did not bring his world into nature, as castle builders did, but found his place in a world that already existed. This deep, almost mystical union with the earth gave him the strength to endure what seemed unbearable. But even the wisest connoisseur of nature found it difficult to survive in complete solitude. He had one, but the most faithful friend and assistant. In the lonely and dangerous life of the medieval shepherd, the dog was more than just a companion animal. It was his partner, his eyes and ears, his indispensable assistant, and often the only living creature with whom he could share his loneliness. The relationship between the shepherd and his dog was based on complete trust and mutual understanding, and this bond was one of the key tricks of survival. Shepherd dogs, the ancestors of modern collies or sheepdogs, were intelligent, hardy, and loyal animals, perfectly adapted to hard work. They helped the shepherd manage a huge flock, driving off straggling sheep, guiding the flock, protecting it from predators. One good dog could do the work of several people. In winter, the role of the dog became even more important. In fog or snowstorms, when visibility was almost nil, the dog, thanks to its sense of smell and hearing, helped to find fleeing lambs or warned of approaching danger, wolves or people. It was a living early warning system. At night, the dog slept beside the shepherd, at the entrance to his shabby hut or simply by the fire. It not only guarded his sleep, but also warmed him with its body. On a cold night, the warm, breathing body of a dog beside him was priceless. She was his living warmth and protector. Moreover, the dog was his only interlocutor. In the long weeks and months of solitude, the shepherd would talk to his dog, sharing his thoughts and worries. This silent friendship saved him from the oppressive feeling of isolation and helped him keep his sanity. The dog was his family, his flock. This ingenious stratagem, using the dog as a multifunctional tool and companion, was the result of centuries of experience. Shepherds valued their dogs above all else, feeding them from their bowl and caring for them. To lose a dog in winter was tantamount to catastrophe. It meant being left blind, deaf, and unarmed in the face of a hostile world. This bond with the animal world was deep, but it was especially dramatic during the most crucial period of winter. The end of winter and the beginning of spring were the busiest and most dramatic times of the year for the shepherd. It was the beginning of the lambing season, the time when a new generation of sheep was born, the future of the flock and the shepherd's livelihood. But this period of birth was inextricably linked to the risk of death, both for the lambs and their mothers. The weather at this time was particularly treacherous. Thaws were followed by sudden frosts, freezing rain and snowfalls. Newborn lambs, wet and weak, were extremely vulnerable to the cold. Leaving them out in the cold for a long time meant dooming them to certain death. Therefore, the shepherd did not sleep much during this time, constantly walking around the flock day and night. He became a midwife for his flock, helping the sheep with difficult births, which were not uncommon. His calloused but sensitive hands welcomed a new life into the world. He had to make sure that the lamb began to breathe, that the mother accepted it and began to feed it. The shepherd would take the weakest lambs, those that were frozen or abandoned by their mothers, with him to his hut. He warmed them by his hearth, wrapped them in old rags, sometimes even breathed on them, trying to bring them back to life. He fed them from a horn with goats' or sheep's milk, if he could get it. His little dwelling became a kind of nursery and intensive care unit. It was a desperate fight for every life. Every lamb that survived was a victory. Every lamb that died was a tragedy and an economic loss. In those weeks, the shepherd gave all his strength, all his warmth, all his care to his flock. His own survival was inextricably linked to the survival of these small, trembling creatures. This painting, a stern man warming a newborn lamb by the fire in his shabby hut, is perhaps the most poignant symbol of the life of a medieval shepherd. It represents the essence of his craft: care, resilience, and deep responsibility for those entrusted to his care. And to keep the fire burning in the hearth in these difficult times, he had to use the most unusual fuel. The diet of a shepherd was even more meager and monotonous than that of a settled peasant. It had to be simple, nutritious, and above all, portable, for the shepherd spent most of his time away from home in the pasture. The contents of his bag were an elaborate survival kit, with each item fulfilling its own function. The basis of his diet was bread, but it was not a soft rustic loaf, but rather hard dry cakes or breadcrumbs made of coarse barley or rye flour. Such bread did not stale for weeks, was light and caloric. It could be chewed on the move or soaked in water or broth. The second most important product was cheese. Shepherds made their own hard, salty sheep cheese, which could also be stored for a very long time. A piece of cheese together with bread was a full, hearty lunch, rich in protein and fat. It was a simple but energetically very valuable food. If a shepherd was lucky, a piece of dried or salted meat, mutton, or lard could be in his bag. This was a real treat and a source of additional energy on the coldest days. But more often we had to do without meat. A small bag with oatmeal or barley groats made it possible to boil a simple porridge or chowder over a fire, adding wild onions or garlic if they could be found. Dried fruits such as apples or berries picked in summer were a source of sweetness and vitamins. A few onions or heads of garlic were always with you. They not only added flavor to unleavened food, but were also considered a remedy for disease. Drinks were also simple: water from a stream or flask, and perhaps some cheap ale or cider. This ingenious simplicity of the diet allowed the shepherd to be completely autonomous for days at a time. He did not need to return to the village for food. He carried everything he needed with him. His diet was perfectly adapted to his lifestyle, rugged, agile, and requiring maximum endurance. And this same self-sufficiency was evident in the way he obtained fuel for his fire. For a shepherd spending the winter on open, often treeless hills and wastelands, obtaining fuel for a fire was a daily and non-trivial task. Unlike the peasant, who had access to the forest, albeit limited, the shepherd had to show marvels of ingenuity in finding combustible materials where there seemed to be none. In a forested area, of course, the main fuel was firewood. The shepherd, more than anyone else, knew where to find dry deadwood, which tree species gave more heat, and how to properly dry damp branches by the fire. But often his pastures were far from the forest, and here other, not the most obvious resources came into play. One of the main fuels on the heaths was heather and thorny shrubs, gorse. The dry stems and roots of these plants burned well, giving a quick and hot fire. The shepherd uprooted them with his knife or staff, collected and dried them. In boggy areas, he could cut and dry peat briquettes in summer, which burned slowly and long, ideal for keeping a fire going through the night. But the most ingenious and truly waste-free trick was the use of dried sheep dung as fuel. In summer, when the dung dried quickly in the sun, the shepherd collected it and put it in piles. These kijaki were a valuable fuel resource. They burned almost without smoke, giving a steady heat, ideal for cooking and heating a small hut. Thus, the herd provided its shepherd not only with food, milk, cheese, meat, clothing, wool, hides, but also with fuel. This was an example of an ideal, closed ecosystem of survival where nothing went to waste. The ability to find or create fuel from literally nothing was one of the key skills that distinguished an experienced herder. And all this wisdom, from building a hut to making fire, was only part of a more general knowledge, the ability to read nature. Perhaps the greatest challenge for the medieval shepherd was not cold or hunger, but oppressive, almost absolute loneliness. Spending weeks or even months away from people, alone with his flock in the vast expanse of land, he had to have incredible fortitude and psychological stability in order not to go mad. His only constant companions were his sheep and, of course, his dog. The dog was not just a helper for the shepherd, but a family member, a friend, a companion. With her, he shared his meager food and warmth by the fire. In its devoted eyes, he found response and understanding. This silent friendship was his main psychological support. Loneliness forced the shepherd to develop his inner world. He was constantly in dialogue with nature, with himself, with God. He knew by heart dozens of ballads, songs, and stories, which he sang or told himself to break the silence. His mind was sharp and observant, and he noticed the slightest changes in the world around him that were hidden from the eyes of the average person. This solitude formed a special type of personality, silent, self-sufficient, independent. The shepherd was not used to relying on others. He knew that in a difficult moment, he would have to rely only on his own strength, his knowledge, and his dog. This made him incredibly resilient and resourceful. But loneliness was also his vulnerability. In case of illness or injury, he could not count on quick help. Any trouble, wolf attack, sudden snowstorm, loss of herd could be fatal. Therefore, the shepherd was extremely careful and prudent. The shepherd's ingenious knack for survival lay not only in his practical skills, but also in his ability to withstand this mental pressure. He turned his loneliness from a curse into a strength, into a source of deep self-knowledge and oneness with the world. His fortress was not within walls, but within himself. The life of the medieval English shepherd was a never-ending struggle for survival in the harshest of conditions. Far from the warmth of village homes and the support of the community, he faced winter armed only with age-old wisdom, a deep knowledge of nature, and his own incredible resilience. His ingenious tricks were simple but effective. He built shelters from what the earth provided, turned his herd into a living wall against the wind, and his clothes into a waterproof cocoon. He could make fire out of nothing and find food where there seemed to be nothing edible. But his main trick was the strength of his spirit, his ability to endure loneliness and find support in himself, his dog, and his inseparable connection with nature. As we study his experience, we see that survival is not always a matter of technology and resources. It is often a matter of adaptation, ingenuity, and a deep respect for the world in which you live. The story of the medieval shepherd is a hymn to human endurance and the quiet, unassuming wisdom that allows life to go on even in the most inhumane conditions. If you are interested in this journey into the harsh and lonely world of medieval pastures, and you want to know more about how people survived in the past, give us a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories of forgotten heroes and their amazing tricks ahead.